Okay, so this is an audio review to finish up Chapter 1, Code of the Street. Okay, so we left off on this slide talking about how there are kind of blurry distinctions between the decent and the street, largely because, like, behaviorally or familial, otherwise, other reasons, it's a little bit more complicated than a us or them kind of situation. But anyway, basically getting back to the idea that the decent family is what makes them different is the kinds of values that they teach to their kids, or really just the children's socialization really has a lot to do with the differences. So, you know, the example given was Marge, the situation where the neighbor didn't want to give the stuff back that their kids had borrowed, right? That kind of idea, kind of touching upon the values of sharing, being polite, being considerate of others, that kind of expectation that they have with other people. But there was a situation where her daughter was being bullied and she stood up to the bully, and therefore the bully retaliated with showing up with 20 people. She had to, like, literally defend her house with a baseball bat. So, you know, this idea that if you were completely decent, you'd be like, well, I would never engage in violence and, you know, kind of lock yourself away, call the police, something like that. But it's the idea that she shows that she's willing to use force to protect her children that's important to the concept of, you know, the kind of normalcy of violence within the neighborhood affects the way that we then socialize our children or just behave, right? So, and also we talked about the financial allure of the street, meaning that because there's so few legitimate opportunities for people to be successful financially within such a poor neighborhood, there's not like a bunch of high-paying jobs sitting around. People have, you know, obviously a terrible education system, which leads to, you know, limited opportunities for, you know, a good job if you don't have a good education. So, you know, this kind of obviously leads to a lot of conflict, but of course a lot of financial concerns. So they understand that their kids may be lured into, you know, maybe gang life or selling drugs or things like that because of the financial problems, you know, of like legitimately not having opportunities, right? And how if they're able to, sometimes we'll talk about later how parents understand that their children are actually engaging in the underground economy in some way, but they look the other way because they desperately need that money to survive, right? So a parent might know that their kid may be selling drugs, but they tend to look the other way. We'll talk about that later, because again, they might completely rely upon the financial contributions of that kid to the household. And so while they disapprove of the behavior and don't want their kid to be engaging in those behaviors, they are desperate for the money. And so it becomes a thing that you just look away from. So anyway, we'll talk about that as well. Okay, so moving on to the decent single mother. So the majority of the families in the inner city neighborhood that he's studying are actually female-headed single mother households. So that means that they have to work even harder to try and keep their children away from the kind of influences and pressures of the street, largely because, you know, again, without another breadwinner present, without another role model or parent there to kind of help share that burden, it's all on one person's shoulders. And so when you're also working multiple jobs just to try to keep the family afloat, it's very difficult to then also make sure that you are monitoring, you know, your kids' interactions with their peers, you know, their behaviors, all that kind of stuff, so you can see, you know, basically so you can make sure that they aren't lured into dangerous behaviors that could negatively harm their lives and futures, right? So she has to press with her authority. So this means she has to be strict and instill certain kinds of values in her kids. And so without having a male role model present, right, if there's no father in the household, it can be especially difficult for, you know, the rearing of young men. Like if there's not that kind of respect going on there, then it's going to be very difficult. Because think of it this way, where, you know, we'll talk about later when we talk about the mating game, how there's this kind of idea that if a father's around, he's going to make sure that, you know, his daughter's only dating the right kind of person, right? We talked about that before. But if there's no dad around, then a lot of young men see that as an opportunity for a woman that might be more vulnerable because, you know, again, not having someone there that can kind of threaten him away. You know, so it's interesting how a lot of this idea is that, you know, if they have a young daughter, that they have to be very on top of that and super strict and super kind of like aggressively strict, because they're just trying to protect their kids from, a lot of times when we're young, we think that we're grown, right? It's like that thing when you watch Maury, the 15-year-olds that are like, I'm grown, I can do what I want, that kind of thing of like not understanding that you developmentally are not an adult, right? But it's funny, you tell that to any 15-year-old, hey, you're not an adult. And they'll be like, yeah, I am. I know what I'm talking about. And you're like, no, you don't. But later you realize that, no, you did not know that when you were 15. But at the time you thought you did, right? So it's kind of part of our developmental problems of, teenagers might think they're making a decision with their own, kind of conscious choice, but they can be much easier to manipulate, right? So that's why parents are very protective at that age. And especially we'll talk later about the issues of pregnancy, right? When you're already in endemic poverty and you're already having a hard time getting educational resources, that just makes a whole nother barrier, right? So the example that he uses is Diane, kind of talking about how in her neighborhood where she's living, there's such a large visible presence of the drug culture that she can't, it's very difficult to keep her 15-year-old son away from it because it's right there. It's in your face all the time, right? And so it's not hidden. It's not, something kind of illicit and far from view. So as a result, it just becomes more, it plays on the mind of youth more so than it would otherwise, right? So, if you hear about, drugs and the culture or issues of, drugs, but you don't actually see it literally every day when you're like walking to school, then you have a different perspective of these things, right? It's not going to kind of press on you as something where you think, hey, maybe that's an option for me, right? So, because again, the more something is present, the more normalized it becomes, the more that it shifts our belief system towards something, right? So, she basically says she disagrees with the ideology of the street, but she also understands it's essential for her son to understand the kind of code of the street because he needs to be safe when he's out there, right? So she says, you have to be street smart to get along, kind of alluding to the fact that although she doesn't want to kind of promote those particular values to her kids, it's a matter of safety. So they have to be aware of what could potentially happen, right? So the organization of street families is a little different. And remember, this is chapter 1. We're going to go into all this stuff much more in depth later. But there tends to be, instead of a sense of community or politeness or consideration for others, there's a lack of consideration for others and a superficial sense of community. So what's interesting is the overwhelming majority of families in this impoverished area where he's doing his research are decent oriented, but the street oriented have a visual presence. And so that's kind of how they change the culture of the neighborhood because they're just so visible. So people tend to think that, they are the majority because they're the people that they see. If they're driving through the neighborhood, walking through the neighborhood, experiencing in that way, they're going to see the street oriented, but they don't see the decent oriented that are behind closed doors, praying or taking care of their kids or whatever it might be. And so it's interesting, though, that in most senses, when we talk about social theory, the majority sets the tone or the expectations for the behavior in a particular space. So what's interesting in this situation is how violence mitigates that, because this is the minority of families. They haven't actually changed the cultural value system of the other families in the neighborhood. It's not like everyone else sees the violence and goes, okay, well, I don't believe in anything anymore. They still have their value systems. It's just that the threat of violence, or the fact that if you stand up to someone and say, hey, I don't agree with what you're doing, you could be killed, means that people are a little bit less likely to do that. And because of the breakdown of the institutional factors that are supposed to protect people, like we'll talk later about issues with policing and other kind of social institutions like the schools and other things in the area, this means that oftentimes people in street families, even with the best of intentions, don't have a lot of resources, right? So this causes a lot of other problems, like this disorganization of lifestyle, right? And so when you have very little, it's kind of interesting that, and I can post this as an additional resource, but it's kind of fascinating how poverty itself plays on the mind and how it affects you emotionally and otherwise. So it's kind of fascinating. There's this recent study, I believe it was Yale, it's one of those fancy ones, that came out with this study about people's kind of destructive behavior in situations of poverty. And so they were looking at how when people were impoverished, they would actually start doing things that were more destructive. But it wasn't the thing that was causing their poverty, but it was in a reaction to poverty. Does this make sense? So for example, we know that there's always been a relationship between alcoholism and homelessness. And while some people do become homeless because they're alcoholics, other people become alcoholics because they're homeless. So it's this interesting situation where, if, let's say, using drugs or being addicted to drugs in a situation of financial resources, you would think, well, if you don't have much money, you're going to save your money, right? But again, if you don't have much money, you feel like that you don't have any real opportunities and that your life could end before you're 25, then there's really no reason to hold on to those limited resources, right? What you have, you just kind of spend and use, right? And so this causes a lot of disorganization. And again, there's consequences of these larger structural failings of just lack of legitimate education, lack of legitimate jobs. It leads to all of this disorganization, right? So it's interesting. We'll talk about how, some of this is a cultural reaction to the structural inequalities that people are facing, right? But it's kind of fascinating, going back to that Yale study, how they found that when people's resources were strapped, there was an uptick in things like, smoking cigarettes or drinking alcohol, things like that were basically just wasteful money, also destructive behaviors. But it's interesting to see how the psychology of just being broke, of just barely getting by and struggling and working very hard but getting nowhere, actually causes a lot of, strife and problems. And in a culture where we don't have free psychological, people can't just access therapists because it's, a pay-for system. That means that people often just don't get the help they need. Also, there's a lot of stigma about looking for mental health resources, so people don't do that either. So it's interesting where instead of people healthily dealing with their problems, they often self-medicate. And so that kind of connects to what we'll talk about later with drugs in the community. So again, the unstable situation, the lack of well-paying jobs, and the persistence of racial discrimination engenders a sense of resentment. So especially in the youth who are being raised in the situation and just see so much inequality as a result. So they basically need to have some control in their lives. And so this means that oftentimes they will lash out at other people, which kind of is reflected in how adults treat their children, right? So meaning it's kind of going back to the basic stress theory. When we're stressed, we're not acting well. We're not being ourselves. We're not kind of our best self. And so a lot of the pressures and problems and things that we face in life, we bring home with us. And so this affects, the way that we treat those around us. And so one of the examples he gives of this is Joe Dickens, who is a poor guy who lives in a crappy house with his 3 kids. And he kind of, gives them as one of the archetypal street families that, he basically is spending all his time hanging out with his friends, oftentimes drinking, smoking, kind of having a never-ending party on their front stoop, right? While his kids are just kind of roaming around. They're pretty much unsupervised, real loud, kind of bother other residents in the neighborhood, right? And so even though his house is really noisy, the cops are called on him pretty often, but they stop showing up, basically, or they show up less and less because, again, when cops get called to the same places over and over and they aren't dealing with like life or death situations, sometimes they kind of taper off, or it can be a situation of rotations and other issues as to why. But the problem for the neighbors is, let's say a situation is happening where your next door neighbor is having a party till 4 a.m, loud as hell, and you need to go to work and you have like a human life. Then if that's happening every day and you call the police and they're not showing up every time you call them, you're going to stop calling them. Like, it just makes sense, right? If you call anything, order a pizza and they stop delivering your pizza, you're going to stop ordering that pizza. It's the same kind of thing. It's like you only put your trust into the resource that actually gives back to you. So for something like that, the neighbors feel helpless because they've called, and all of them have called at some point. And, they think that he's dealing drugs because people are showing up and leaving at all times, and it seems pretty obvious. And they're just hanging out like in the light of day on the front steps of the house, exchanging money and things like this. But think about it. Why don't the neighbors confront him? Like, if this was your neighbor, would you confront him? If it's a guy who's hanging out with like 4 to 5 other adult men at all times, just kind of straight chilling, waiting for a fight? No. So obviously, without the police showing up, they feel hopeless, that no one cares. And there's really nothing that they can do about it themselves. Maxine's another example that he gives of a street family. So she has 6 kids who are just unsupervised and running around causing hell. And so basically, her new boyfriend that moves in with her is like a blatant drug dealer. And so he's, there's this presence in the neighborhood that comes about as a result of just him being there dealing. And so this means that there's like, some very loud, violent confrontations with drug addicts, like in the street, in front of the house. And so the police were called for a particularly bad incident he talks about in the chapter. But, this is just kind of one of the archetypes he's talking about for these, for the kind of organization of the families, right? Where obviously you can see the kind of relationships he's making here about what are the parents' behaviors, what are the kids' behaviors, what are the expectations for behavior, that kind of fun stuff. So what's interesting in general about what he found out of after spending years within the neighborhood is that street women tend to have different parenting styles than the decent oriented women who are also often single mothers that are trying to instill backbones in their kids and work hard. The street oriented mothers have a very different approach to parenting. They parent their kids sporadically, so meaning sometimes they take care of their kids, sometimes they're dealing with their own stuff, or sometimes they're being basically, when you look at this situation where some people are addicted to drugs, then obviously drug abuse really does impact family situations. Meaning, if you're addicted to something, like you're an alcoholic and you're always at a bar, or you're a drug addict and you're always doing your drugs, you're basically diverting your focus from your children to yourself, right? Because the addiction plays with your mind and controls you in a lot of ways, right? So like I said before, a lot of people in the community are touched by the effects of drug addiction and drug culture. And so the children are often the victims of this, right? So grandparents can step in and take care of the kids if they're able to do so. But we'll talk about later how that might not be that helpful either, because this is the same grandparent that raised the parent that's also addicted to drugs. So we'll talk about that later. The children basically learn they have to fight for a place in this world. They learn that their survival is not guaranteed, because oftentimes, neighbors or, distant family members or things like that will find these kids in these desperate situations where they've been abandoned or traumatized, or they're just kind of left to their own devices to take care of themselves. So, some of these kids basically learn that, they have to be the parent, right? Like if your parent is a drug addict, then, all the kind of things that we take for granted that parents do for children become oftentimes children doing for parents, like reminding them what to do and how to, do things. And so this means that, kind of going back to that social learning theory we talked about at the very top of this, that our environment, the experiences we have, affect what we consider to be normal. So if you come up in a situation where you're expected to kind of defend yourself, protect yourself, provide for yourself, that's obviously going to affect the way that you then kind of see the world, right? So for these kids, they learn to fight at a pretty young age, because again, if you have violence as a normative feature of your neighborhood, you want to make sure you can protect yourself and you're safe. So this kind of like insulates or motivates the knowledge of fighting, right? And then they're also victimized, right, by the anger and the physical aggression of their families, by the social disorganization of the neighborhood, the lack of social structural resources. Like these kids should just be in school and living their lives like, basically like trading stickers with each other and using crayons. But instead they're basically learning how to try to navigate this really adult environment and keep themselves and oftentimes their other siblings safe, right? Which is a lot to put on a kid. Okay, so social norms this is how, the kind of expectations. When we say norms, we just mean what's normal, right? So the decent refer to the cultural difference in social norms as ignorance, right? So it's interesting, the social norm, again, it's just a cultural expectation for how you're supposed to act in any situation. So this idea of ignorance just means kind of being ignorant of, like, what is it that they're saying they're ignorant of? The middle class expectations of like how you're supposed to behave, right? So that's why it's called ignorance, because it's just kind of assuming that people don't understand the rules, right? Like someone is like says hello to you and you'll say hello back. You don't like, flip them off, or you know what I mean, or have like a kind of negative, violent reaction to those things. That the social norms are how we kind of govern how we get to interact with each other, is that we have a shared set of norms, and then based on that we interact, right? So this means that the norms are being challenged, right? So as a result, the decent rarely challenge the street oriented, even though they disagree with their actions and their mentality, because they know that there could be a big threat of violence for challenging them, right? Or a threat of repercussions. So even if you win the fight that you're in, that doesn't mean this guy's not going to come back with 20 people. So this kind of social organization of the neighborhood means, a whole group of people could show up to exact their revenge. You're going to think twice about starting that fight with somebody, right? And so other times, though, you will decide, you know what, actually, I am going to challenge street oriented. And so this is what the decent refer to as getting ignorant, right? So basically, they see it as they're lowering themselves to the standards of the street oriented, right? And they'll engage in similar behaviors, typically in order to confront them when the decent are being pushed to the breaking point, just like the mom having to, use the baseball bat to keep a bunch of people away from her house. Like, normally, most of us don't swing baseball bats at human people, hopefully, but obviously in situations of stress like that, you may, right? So Yvette is another example of this that he gives about how the decent parents struggle to keep their kids away from the street. So her parents practically lock her in the house in order to keep her away from the elements of the neighborhood that could like negatively affect her future. So her parents sacrificed. They sent her to private school so she could have great opportunities. And when he was doing the interviews with her, she was a college student working, pre-med, like on her way to be a doctor. And it's interesting because he used her as a way to kind of talk about the blurring of the social norms of decent oriented and street oriented. Because obviously she's very decent oriented. She's a pre-med in a situation where, a lot of violence is happening in that neighborhood. But while her parents are supportive, her extended family is a bit more street oriented, and they see her as a sellout. Right? So, and her mother also. So her aunt specifically has a 6th grade education. And, when her, niece starts going to college, she basically says to her like, oh, you think you're better than me? Which I'm sure for most of you, when you decided to go to college, you weren't like, I'm going to do this to show my aunt, right? I mean, obviously, it's not really about her aunt, but it's the idea of, think about it with the social institutions, what we talked about before, of kind of having an adversarial relationship, meaning that seeing her as connecting to an institution that rejects a lot of people, then it seems like counterintuitive to some. So basically to say, if dominant society rejects you, then it's kind of logical to reject dominant society. So what if your niece is like, no, I'm cool with dominant society that gets rid of my legitimate opportunities, that makes me struggle so hard just for the same things all these other people have just by being born easily. You can see that as selling out in a way, right? If you're in that neighborhood or in that context. And especially when her aunt herself had such limited opportunities that it's almost like a jealousy to see someone being able to succeed with so little, right? So, one part of this too is that her father was actually her uncle because, all this kind of drama when she was born, her uncle was there and just kind of became that father role model that she referred to as her father. But of course, her cousin, being spiteful, was like, oh, that's your uncle, to try and hurt her feelings. But she didn't really care because she just appreciated having a strong male role model in her immediate family that, was there, provided for her, was just a support for her whole life, and struggled so that she could have success, right? And so her, again, this isn't like weird drama. Her mom just like divorced the father when she was a baby. So for all of her, memories, that is the person who's always been there for her, right? So her story basically shows the difficulties that decent families encounter, not only from their neighbors, but from like their own extended families. So again, she talked about the fact that crime is so prevalent in the neighborhood that where they live, they had 4 cars stolen, right, over time. and that the prevalence of violence in the drug trade in the neighborhood is just visible. You see it all over the place. And so there's also, she talked about having a shift of just seeing way more single mothers in the time period where he was doing the research as well. So, and we'll talk about the kind of economic fallout that was going on at that time period and how that's kind of spread to larger society now. So, and she also talked about all of these kind of other important things about the discrimination that her mom faces in an all-white workforce, right? And how, basically the only way she was able to have the opportunities that she did was her parents really, really struggling. But also, her house is like a prison. Like there's the neighbors are problematic, the family's problematic, but basically the way that she became successful, it came at a consequence of kind of social interaction. Like she really had to just be locked up all day, all night, kind of just studying, working on those things. And that's, kind of really taking away something from someone as well. So it's, the community aspect, the human aspect. So, basically he just uses some of these specific people as examples to illustrate the points he's trying to make about what he saw in the time he was doing the research in the neighborhood.